Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tammy Bryant-Spratling, and I go by she, her pronouns. It is my honor to serve as the Chief Executive Officer of Community Tampa Bay. We are pleased that you virtually joined us today for our fourth installment of the Huddle for Change initiative. Today's conversation is surrounding racial wealth equity. Tampa Bay is experiencing fast and exciting growth. However, with that growth, we are seeing ever-increasing disparities in homeownership and wealth attainment. We are pleased that you've joined us for today in this community conversation. First, before we get started with today's program, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about Community Tampa Bay. Community Tampa Bay envisions a community free from all forms of discrimination, where every individual is treated with dignity and respect with regard to their race, ethnicity, nationality, sex, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, faith, and age. We have been creating space for anti-discrimination work in the Tampa Bay area since the 1940s. We believe that cross-cultural connection and dialogue are essential in breaking down the biases, prejudices, and stereotypes that contribute to systemic discrimination. Therefore, our mission is to cultivate inclusive leaders to change communities through dialogue and cross-cultural interaction. In other words, we empower people with tools to have hard conversations with people who don't look like them, love like them, or live like them. We are pleased to partner with the Super Bowl host committee for the Huddle for Change initiative. Through this community dialogue series, we are working together as a community to explore 5 topics related to race equity: physical health, mental health, the wealth gap, education, and the criminal justice system. We specifically have developed an interactive and facilitated program to encourage connection. We will then take our shared conversations and develop our next steps because we believe we can truly eradicate racial inequities in Tampa Bay with community participation. For each community conversation, we've used data provided by the Tampa Bay Partnership. That's just the starting point. We then take a panel of experts who are already engaging in the work. You'll be able to hear from some of them today. To further facilitate our small group dialogues that we'll have later on in the program, we've created a follow-along worksheet for you to consider and jot down some notes as we go along. You will see a link dropped in the chat now. Moving forward with the next part of our program, I have the pleasure of introducing today's panel, starting with our moderator, Matthew Chin from Northwestern Mutual. Matthew was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. Coming from a diverse background and having lived in numerous cities, Matthew enjoys immersing himself in different cultures and customs. He runs a financial planning and insurance practice with Northwestern Mutual. When away from his business, he is passionate about actively uplifting the underserved populace. He is a fierce advocate for human rights, equality, and supporting fellow locally owned businesses. Matthew will be joined by 3 panelists. Let's get to know each one of them. First, Jessica Maroff. Jessica joined United Way Suncoast in November 2019 after establishing a record of transformative change with the Girl Scouts of West Central Florida and Frameworks of Tampa Bay as their CEO. She also has worked as a manager of account services for Raymond James Financial, marketing director for Saks Fifth Avenue, and account executive at Roberts Communication. During her time in her current role at United Way Suncoast, Jessica has helped refresh its brand, galvanize the community through the COVID-19 outbreak, and guided the creation of a new strategic vision for the organization. Next is Ralph John Poi. Ralph is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for Suncoast Credit Union. Ralph and Suncoast take pride in continuing to improve the quality of their members' lives. At Suncoast, they proudly serve everyone while understanding that the members' needs will be different across the board, and believe that this reality fuels the diversity of their products and diversity of people they hire to deliver excellent service. Ralph is passionate about helping leaders understand the difference that they can make through intentional interactions. Finally, our third panelist is Kareem Spratling. Kareem is managing partner of the Tampa office of Bryant Miller Olive, PA. His legal practice is primarily focused in the area of public finance. He has represented governmental and quasi-governmental entities at all levels, including at the state of Florida level, as well as the United States. Mr. Spratling is committed to sharing his public finance knowledge as chair of the National Association of Bond Lawyers General Law and Practice Committee. He regularly lectures on topics of public finance and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before Matthew takes over with our panel, we will hear Dave Sobush provide a data overview. Dave is the Director of Policy and Research at the Tampa Bay Partnership. He is an expert in economic development research and project management. In his role at the Tampa Bay Partnership, he leverages a career of project management, data analysis, planning and reporting, and development and implementation of recommendations to enhance prosperity and economic competitiveness throughout the Tampa Bay region. Now, I'm pleased to turn it over to Mr. Dave Sobush, who will give an overview of our data, and then on to Matthew, who will provide our panel discussion.
Thank you, and hello. I'm Dave Sobush, Director of Policy and Research for the Tampa Bay Partnership. Alongside our collaborators, Community Foundation Tampa Bay and United Way Suncoast, we produce the annual Regional Competitiveness Report. We present our findings each year at the State of the Region community event in partnership with the USF MUMA College of Business. For those of you who have attended State of the Region community events, you have heard us scratch the surface of some high-level equity issues when we ask the question, are we creating an economy that works for everyone? In 2020, that question became even more relevant and caused us to investigate further and look deeper. The result is the Regional Equity Report. Today, I will present to you highlights of this report. But first, I want to provide a quick view of the report itself and show you the depth of the data that's available. When you access the report at stateoftheregion.com, you'll find comparisons to 19 peer and aspirational metro areas in the United States, and you'll also find a county-by-county breakdown of the racial and ethnic disparities among the counties within the Tampa Bay region. The depth and breadth of information in the report is in direct response to stakeholder feedback we've received over the years. Let's dive in and get started. While poverty is an imperfect measure of financial instability, it provides insight into the extent to which families face income distress and must make hard choices each and every day. Tampa Bay overall ranks 15th among the comparison communities with a poverty rate of 14.1%, matching the average rate of the nation as a whole. Tampa Bay's poverty equity gap ranks roughly in the same vicinity, 16th out of 20. In the equity gaps, we take a look at the comparative differences between the experience of Black residents of Tampa Bay and white residents of Tampa Bay. And with poverty, here's the sobering statistic. Black residents of Tampa Bay are 2.5 times as likely to live in poverty relative to their white neighbors. Within the region, the gap is less pronounced in Citrus County, where whites are actually more likely to live in poverty than Blacks. But the gap is most pronounced in Sarasota, where Black residents are 3 times as likely to live in poverty than their white neighbors. Diving deeper, we examine the share of children living in poverty. As with poverty overall, Tampa Bay, at 20.7%, ranks 15th out of the 20 markets for the share of children living in poverty. In terms of the youth poverty equity gap, more than 1 of every 3 Black children in Tampa Bay live in poverty, relative to roughly 1 in 8 white children. The inequity results in a 22.5% difference between children of these 2 races. Within Tampa Bay, Pinellas County has the largest youth poverty equity gap. Black children in that county are nearly 4 times more likely to be living in poverty relative to their white counterparts. Our research finds that wages in Tampa Bay trail the comparison communities, and with respect to the top performing communities in a significant way, 26% below the top 5 markets. Largely because of these low wages, Tampa Bay's hourly wage equity gap is the smallest among the comparison cohort. But here's the stark reality. Black workers earn 21.4% less than white workers. Making 79 cents on the dollar seems like little cause for celebration. Within Tampa Bay, we found that Pasco County cuts the regional wage gap in half, with 9.9% difference compared to the 21.4% regional average. Hillsborough County's hourly median wage gap of 29.5% is the largest within Tampa Bay. We know that educational attainment has a profound effect on earnings and is another area where Tampa Bay regularly and significantly underperforms the competition. Only 28.3% of Tampa Bay residents aged 25 and older have earned a bachelor's degree, one common measure of achievement. As with the equity gap in hourly wages, Tampa Bay's gap between Black and white educational attainment is relatively small. However, in both cases, we are seriously underperforming our competitors. Our white residents are the least likely to have a bachelor's degree among the comparison community, and Black residents of the region rank 17th out of the 20 cities for educational attainment. Among the communities of Tampa Bay, Black residents in Pasco County are significantly more likely to have a bachelor's degree vis-a-vis their white neighbors. Black educational attainment in that county nearly matched the regional average for white attainment. Sarasota has the highest white attainment and the lowest Black attainment, and as a result, the largest equity gap. As we mentioned earlier, education plays a powerful role in determining how much income an individual can earn. The higher the educational attainment, the higher the income. One of the most startling findings in the equity report is this. For Black workers who have earned the highest level of education we tracked, a bachelor's degree or higher, they experienced the largest wage gap, 20.8%. Within Tampa Bay, once again, Pasco County has the smallest wage gap by educational attainment at the bachelor's degree level. At 8.7%, its equity gap is less than half of the regional figure. Regarding the gap in wages for college graduates, we need to probe the following questions. Does the hiring process create the gap? Are we not encouraging our Black students to pursue advanced degrees beyond the bachelor's degree? Do our Black students lack the necessary career guidance and preparation? We've taken a look at inequities in earnings, but what about wealth? Home ownership is an important indicator as it provides insight to income and financial stability and is also a vehicle for the creation of generational wealth. Overall, Tampa Bay ranks third in home ownership rates, with more than 2/3 of housing units owner-occupied. Where the equity gap is concerned, however, Tampa Bay ranks far worse. Nearly 3/4 of white residents in Tampa Bay own their homes, compared to 40% of Black residents. Tampa Bay's home ownership equity gap ranks 15th. Within Tampa Bay, Citrus and Pasco counties have the lowest home ownership equity gap. Pinellas and Manatee at 33% and 36.8% each exceed the regional gap of 32.5%. For Hillsborough and Pinellas counties, white home ownership is more than double the rate of Black home ownership. This research merely sets the table for the conversation today, and I thank you for your preparation, participation in this critical discussion, and leadership on this important issue. Thanks again.
Guys, it's really great spending some time with you today and discussing the wealth gap and hearing your own perspective on what we can do as a community. So we'll jump right into the questions, and I'm going to go with Jessica first. Jessica, in your own words and experience, please define the racial wealth gap. What experience do you have working closely in closing this gap?
Well, this is part of our focus at United Way Suncoast, and just to put it quite simply, White households in the US on average have 10 times more wealth than Black households and 8 times more wealth than Latinx households. And that gap is the technical definition, right? But really the deeper definition is how people of color in our community are faced with so many more barriers because of this wealth gap. Access to credit, access to housing. I mean, the list could go on. And at United Way Suncoast, we address this in many ways. We have neighborhood resource centers to which the residents of that community can walk to a physical location and get all the support and services that they need in one place and not having to navigate through multiple different systems or locations. Our Bank On programs that we have in partnership with many of our local and regional financial institutions to help the unbanked and underbanked with financial products to support them, and as well as our volunteer income tax assistance program, because we've just kicked off tax season, and we're supporting our region and families and individuals and getting their tax completed for free so that they can get that money back to them in the coming months.
Fantastic. Ralph, I know it's a little unique, my Caribbean brother, so we have a different outlook, slightly different perception. In your experience and in your own words, what's your definition of the wealth gap? And
yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Matthew. And I think Jessica put it plainly. It's understanding that different racial demographics in this nation have far more wealth than others. Like she mentioned, 10 times on one and 8 times if we're comparing to our Latin communities. So I think, and there's many contributing factors to why that is. And I think to start the conversation with just what it looks like today is not enough. We got to go back to how did this happen? You know, how is this race so unfair? And I know, for example, from Suncoast Credit Union perspective, is we're taking a look at, you know, what is some of the issues, and some of them is the knowledge. And so that's why we have programs like our financial youth literacy program, where we go out to the communities and we bring the information to the generation that is to come, because we believe that in order to make a real change, you have to equip. And that's what we're trying to do with our generation, not just the younger generation, the current generation as well, but we do put a strong emphasis on the younger ones to come, because we want them to not only gain wealth, but be able to manage it and continue to sustain it as well. So that's how we try to tackle the issue of the racial wealth gap, which we want everyone to have access, and we got to give them access to education and knowledge.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, be awareness of the history and what has taken place over the past decades. I think just awareness, and a lot of folks just don't realize that what the gap is. Taking the time to educate them on that gap. So I appreciate that. Kareem, to you, same question I'll pose in your words and experience. What does the racial gap mean to you?
Absolutely. I think Jessica and Ralph, they crushed it. And my personal identity, I identify as Black male, African American, and I can relate to this issue from my own personal struggle as a young person. I'll date myself a little bit, but when I was young, coming right out of college, Kanye West had this hit song, The Good Life, and he raps, having money's not everything, not having it is. And anyone who's ever experienced food insecurity or rent insecurity or transportation insecurity, something similar to that, they know how true that is. And there's science to back it up, right? When you're broke, it's an ever-present stressor, and things build upon one another. You can't get to work, now you lose your job, it gets worse and worse and worse. And ironically, on the other side of the coin, what we also know from the science is that after you meet certain basic level of living the American dream, the bell curve starts to flatten in terms of increased wealth versus happiness, right? So in any event, I'm thankful. I thank God, I thank my ancestors, I thank my mentors that I'm not broke today, but I've certainly been there, and I felt that wealth gap. In terms of experiences on closing the gap early on in my life, I did similar to what Ralphie has done. I focused a great deal of my time and talent on financial literacy and one-on-one budgeting training with people. As I have progressed sort of in my profile and my career, I've had the opportunity to focus a little bit more on a different angle in terms of reaching a different audience. So I have, for example, with my trade organization, tried to teach them on diversity, equity, and inclusion, with the goal to making sure that discrimination, whether it be intentional or unintentional, doesn't creep into their hiring process doesn't creep into their compensation process, because that's part of the problem too. It's a smaller part of the problem that people just aren't being paid the same thing. And then also in my role as the vice chair of Feeding Tampa Bay, what we talk about is food for today, food for tomorrow, and food for a lifetime. And the food for a lifetime ties right into this issue, right? You try to empower people who come into the food bank to gain new education and gain the tools they need to try to help close that wealth gap for them and their families.
Great. You know, I think you hit the nail on the head. Everyone's perception and their reality is very different. And folks that are in survival mode, where you and I come in, is just educating through those workshops on the basics, right? Because people can't, sometimes when they're in survival mode, it's hard to think straight or to think outside of the box because it's just day by day. So thank you all for those answers. Going on to our next question. I'm going to point this question to Karine. What historical laws and policies contributed to the racial wealth gap, and how has it been perpetuated to this very day?
Ooh, that is a lot. And, it does. It has to tap into history, and I'm going to tap into my time as a history major in undergrad. But you know, I'm not going to pull punches. The number one reason for the wealth gap, particularly between Black Americans and white Americans, is the African slave trade in this country. Slavery in America lasted from about 1619 to 1865, which is 246 years. I use 1865 instead of 1863 because it took an extra 2 years for even the enslaved people in the South to be released. So then you go from 65 to 1866, where you have the Black Codes, which is basically slavery light. Then you go to 1866 to 1954 with the god-awful separate but equal type of doctrine. So in Fisher County, got 58 years of Black Americans in this country being treated as a lesser race. And what does this all have to do with the wealth gap? Well, really, it's everything. So if you just go back for a little bit further in history, even initially, the idea of race in the human language was a type of profession, right? Like a race of monks, a race of priests. And it was in the early 18th century where all of a sudden the use of race in the English language goes to a race of people, and it's meant to be a race of Blacks as being inferior, or a race of the Native American people as being inferior to the whites. And of course, this all happens at the same time that the African slave trade is popping up in America and in the colonies. And all of this is important because slavery is not unique to the United States, but in the United States, our type of slavery was particularly awful, and that it attached this notion of slavery to a race of people, a color of people, and all of their descendants. And then what we did is we put in place contradictory legal constructs to make it still work, right? To make it apply to a certain type of people. So going back to the matter at hand, right? Now you have 1776 to 1968, which is 192 years of tough battles on slavery. The US, just so you know, will celebrate our 246th birthday this year. Slavery was abolished when our country was 86. Then you go through the golden era of civil rights, ended when the country was 192. So that's not that long ago. So during that time, you're combating separate but equal, you're combating discrimination in housing, et cetera, et cetera. So for the vast majority of our country's history, right, you have a strong legal and policy construct that allowed Black Americans to be treated as someone else's wealth, another person's wealth, right, enslaved people. And then thereafter, they're still being purposely subjugated, purposely being denied the American dream. So how does this again tie into where we came in today? After slavery ended, President Lincoln and his administration, they knew kind of what was the one thing that would help create some wealth for these formerly enslaved people, and the idea was land. And in fact, they had an executive order that they had drawn up to grant land to enslaved peoples to help them provide for themselves. Unfortunately, President Lincoln was assassinated. That executive order never got executed, and President Johnson scrapped it really on the idea, which is interesting, that by doing that for enslaved peoples, you would be discriminating against white people, which is something that we hear, right? So why is land so important? We know this as a fact for the vast majority of Americans. Where they derive most of their net worth is from the equity in their homes. So now you have a situation, you didn't have homes, you didn't get that land that you have, you've been discriminated against, you've been purposefully subjugated and treated as lesser. So how are you going to derive that big chunk of where everyone else gets their value? The other thing that's important kind of in the land idea is this concept called redlining. And to summarize, redlining basically means that in a certain area, particular services, financial or otherwise, are withheld from potential customers who reside in a particular neighborhood that's deemed hazardous for investment. So these neighborhoods, of course, it's the hood, right? It's typically racial and ethnic minorities. So for example, you deny them credit or insurance or healthcare, or you have a food desert, and all these things sort of build on one another, and they choke off equity into those neighborhoods, until such time as then they become gentrified, which is another story. So in plain language, right, you're forcing these people to live in these neighborhoods, and then you're not investing in the neighborhood, so it kind of multiplies the problem. To make matters worse, there's this concept called reverse redlining, where then certain financial institutions, they go into those neighborhoods and then they feed subprime mortgages and predatory lending. And the net effect of that, right, is that even as of 2019, the US Federal Reserve put out a report that said 73.7% of white Americans own their home, while 44% of Blacks own their home, right? And again, remember, we talked about the fact that the way most Americans, where their net worth comes from, is their home, the equity in their homes. They have no home. So what has been happening? Over the course of time, during these civil rights battles that we talked about, there has been federal and state legislation, particularly the Fair Housing Act, that sought to combat this issue. And also there's been enforcement litigation by the US government as well as the state government. And even in the past 10 years, we've had major banks being hit with 9-figure settlements in the past 10 years on this issue. But still, right, the issue continues, and what we've seen is the gap continues to increase. And part of that, again, also has to do, for example, with reverse redlining. During the Great Recession, Blacks were more likely to be particularly hit by the Great Recession because they were also more likely to have these subprime mortgages or have interesting mortgage projects where you have a balloon payment all of a sudden in 10 years, no one's going to refinance you. Another place that we've seen it recently in the news, we've seen appraisals from time to time where whether it's true, actual purposeful discrimination or implicit bias, where you have someone go in and they appraise a home that they know is owned by a Black person, you get a questionable appraisal, and then the person puts a white person there at the seat at the appraisal, and the appraised value is materially better. Locally, the way that's affecting us is 2/3 of citizens own their homes, which is awesome, but our Black, Latino, and Hispanic brothers and sisters are outpaced 2-to-1 on that issue. So I think that we've made a lot of progress in the years that have come, but there's definitely much work to be done.
Absolutely. We could talk finances all day long, but we won't do that. I think, wealth, generational wealth, the primary factor in generational wealth is homeownership. And that takes time. That takes time to recover from that. It takes time to correct itself. So we still have some work to do. But I appreciate your answer. We're going to move to the next question, and I'm going to go with Ralph first on this one. Actually, let's go to Jessica first on this one. We talk about ALICE, or the acronym ALICE, Asset Limited Income Constraint Employed, and it's a crucial aspect in analyzing the racial wealth gap and understanding the households in the U.S. Can you explain what ALICE families are, and in your experience working with them?
Absolutely. So this is a research study that we produce every 2 years. And ALICE, as you said, is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. These are hardworking, employed individuals and families who do not make enough to afford a basic household budget. And in the state of Florida, that the percentage of families who fall within this threshold, families and individuals, is 46%. In our region here in Tampa Bay, it's 43%. So nearly half of our community is just barely making enough to make ends meet. And why is this important is because of all the factors that have just already been shared. These families are working really hard and just being able to stay afloat. They are one crisis away from being thrown financially off course. The other really important thing to note about this is that, unfortunately, that is 2018 data. We haven't updated the ALICE report yet because of COVID and the implications on some of our surveying that we do to get the data that we need. However, MIT's cost of living calculator, which has been updated, has shown, which we all knew was happening, the increase of costs post-pandemic. For example, cost for a family of four within the ALICE threshold of 2018 to get by was $74,160. Whereas if you look at the costs for a family of four using MIT's calculator for 2021, the cost to get by is $86,299. So when you think about that number, you're like, well, wait a minute, that's a big number, but and it's probably more than what you think people need. But when you factor in, I mean, just think about this: costs like $780 per month per kid for childcare. Rent in Hillsborough County, at the bare minimum is $1,200, and that's actually $500 too low for a two-bedroom apartment. So that $86,000 is just not enough for so many individuals and families. So, with our work and how we address this is, first of all, is educating our community about families who are struggling. And that may be your next door neighbor, that might be the person that you see at the grocery store, and making sure that our community knows about ALICE and why it's important to help these families get on some financial stable footing. And all of our investments in the community, because we grant millions of dollars to nonprofits to really help and advance the financial stability of our ALICE families. We also do a lot in early learning and youth success. And again, we're measuring how we're supporting these families so that they can have that financially stable and that thriving future for themselves and their families.
Awesome work, Jessica. We appreciate you. I appreciate you and the work that you're doing. Our next question, I'm going to go to Ralph first. Please explain the difference between income and wealth gap, the income gap and the wealth gap.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. For me, the way that I think about income is something that you earn, right? So the salary that you have from the place that you work, or if you're an entrepreneur, whatever you bring in, that's income. But I think that has a potentially to fluctuate a lot. So if I work for an organization like Suncoast, if I no longer have my job, now I no longer have income. But I think wealth is something that's more sustainable, more long-term. And that's why we keep talking about the conversation of generational wealth. And I think Kareem did a fantastic job talking about the history of just how the gap has happened and why we continue to still see it today. If we think about wealth and how it's been transferred over from generation to generation, you're talking about families who started hundreds of years ago. And there's research where you can do the math, because what happens is compounding interest is in your favor. So if you had this home from years ago, it's continued to appreciate in value. You're able to pass that on to your children, or able to take out equity loans or things of that nature to do certain things to build more wealth. So that wealth continues to grow. And so income, it is important, very, very important, but income can be something that can be taken away from you depending on your situation. But when you really start to focus on wealth and generational wealth, you're passing on something to the future that's going to be more sustainable. That's going to have that, and not only sustainable, but it's going to continue to grow over time. So yes, income is important. But I think in my current generation, what I want to focus on is how do I build more wealth so I can pass on more to my child, so he can pass on more to his children. Absolutely.
Kareem, I'm gonna point that question to you also to hear your take on it. What's in your opinion? What is the difference between the income gap and the wealth gap?
I 100% agree with Ralph, and I like to, as a lawyer in my day job, a finance lawyer at that, I like to draw from real verifiable data. And I'm looking at an October 2021 report from the U.S. Federal Reserve that says the average Black and Hispanic or Latino household earns about half as much as the average white household. And that's your income, right? And as Ralph pointed out, that fluctuates all the time. You have a problem with that income and you don't have wealth, it creates a whole host of problems, as Jessica pointed out in the part that she was just talking about. Wealth, again, right, is your real estate, your businesses, your stocks and bonds. And in that same report from the US Federal Reserve, they wrote, and I'm going to read this because it's so important, the racial inequities are concentrated at the extremes of distribution, with white households disproportionately accounting for very high wealth segments and Black and Hispanic households disproportionately accounting for lower wealth segments. That's huge, right? Because you've got the polarization of it too. To make this point too, and this is not to diss business makers, but sometimes I hear my friends that are business creators say, well, you know what, I built this business and I didn't draw a salary, I didn't have any income for years. What they don't tell you is they had multi-million-dollar investments that were essentially paying them interest and keeping them very comfortable while they were building up that business. I think that's the difference, right? You have not had that generational wealth to pass down to build you up so that you can withstand the dips when your income fluctuates, as Ralph mentioned. That's how I view it.
Capital also, people don't think of the capital portion.
Right.
Slaves were considered capital at one point because they were owned. And it's a part of the generational wealth that got passed down. So yeah, great answer.
If I can just add, to something that Kareem said, I think, when you have a certain level of wealth, then some people don't even need income. They can survive for a little bit without income. And I think it's not the same thing for the other side, where if you're income dependent, then most likely you probably do not have a lot of wealth either. So I think that's one of the key differentiating factors for me too.
Absolutely. Jessica, we're gonna bounce back to you real quick. What are some of the most common challenges people face that are in financial hardship? I know you probably see this every single day.
Well, I'm going to talk again about our Alice families because they are one hardship away from crisis. And so the common challenge that people face is the inability to secure enough savings to address sudden costs. With healthcare, schooling, and the other necessary aspects of life coming with such high price tags, one unforeseen but necessary cost can cause years of financial strain. And this is exacerbated by race. And I'm gonna quote the Federal Reserve Bank data again here. And that tells us that 72% of all white households would cover a $400 emergency expense using cash or its equivalent. And only 45% of Black households could say the same, and 47% for our Hispanic households. And although that data point has been improving, the racial gap there has been stagnant. So, the inability to build savings is, of course, not just a personal issue, and therefore the solution isn't just to tell people, hey, save more money. The issue with all of this is societal. Subsistence living prevents most Alice families from saving anything. And these issues, multiplied by the racial barriers to wealth building and income, create a system where it's nearly impossible for them to save, even with the best of intentions. This is why we have programs at United Way Suncoast that help to create that sustainable infrastructure for them, from workforce development, our volunteer income tax assistance program to help them with their taxes and to get those returns, our bank on programs with our partnerships with our banking institutions for banking products that help and support them, financial coaching, our neighborhood work, all of this really, coming together to support the individuals in the ways in which they need to help them build that financially stable future.
It's something that I call on a daily basis, the hamster wheel, the financial hardship hamster wheel, and trying to get off of that hamster wheel and continuously running. So I'm going to point this question to Ralph and see what his take on it is. What are some of the challenges that you think folks face when facing financial hardship?
Yeah, I think there's many challenges when folks face financial hardship. As we've talked about, There's statistics that put out there, a certain amount of Americans cannot afford a $400 or $500 emergency. And we all know that emergencies happen all the time. We have cars that we drive, and we have medical concerns and issues that come up. And for that person, like we talk about, they're one bill away or one emergency away from not being able to provide for their family. So there's many different things that can lead to that. But what we think is very important in terms of from Suncoast Credit Union perspective is understanding Alice households. So the one that really stuck out to me is the word E, the letter E, and that's employed. So these are not people that are waiting for something. These are people that are working hard. They're working hard, they're contributing, but they're just not getting as much as they're putting in. So when we go out to these communities and talk to these folks, I think it starts with understanding where they're at. Understanding, I can't just come out there and say, hey, listen, the way to generational wealth is you got to buy a home. Well, that person is going to look at me as, well, you don't understand my situation. I think there's a roadmap there. There's some assessments that we need to do, understanding, help them manage what are the things that we can control, and the things that we can't control, what do we do about them? And then let's start thinking about what we have to look forward to. So maybe buying a home may not be the immediate thing to help with the current situation, but let's begin to learn about what can that look like in the future. How do I equip myself to understand, how do I make a better future for myself? And I believe that making a better future for myself, it doesn't start in the future, it starts right now. We got to plant those seeds now. But I think it's very important to remember that these are hardworking individuals, and they're just one bill or just one incident away from not being able to provide the way that they want to. And we have to step up and be able to do something about that.
I love that perspective, because when you say that, I think of minimum wage, livable wage, and what the average cost of a fast food combo is, and compare it to how much that person has to work to afford lunch at their establishment. And then that's the perspective that I talk about, or I use the analogy that I use. So great point. I love it. Ralph, I'm going to point this question to you. Recognizing unequal social and economic origins, what advice would you give to people on how to start accumulating and then sustaining wealth?
Yeah, I'm always gonna go back to education. I will say that one of the things that I'm very, very proud of, and especially in the Black community now that I'm seeing, is that there's a overwhelming interest and intrigue and just hunger and thirst for learning more about ways to build wealth, like the stock market. So I would encourage people to educate yourself, right? I'm not asking folks to jump in and start investing, but I would encourage you to understand, well, what creates wealth? And once you understand what creates wealth, and you can start with as little as you can, but I would definitely start understanding what can you contribute, so that way you can build a better future for yourself. Understanding how debt works, understanding how you can use debt, leverage debt to create more opportunities for yourself. Understanding personal finances and the discipline that comes with it. Understanding the difference between wants and needs, because sometimes those are the things that holds us back as well. We can contribute more to wants than we do to needs, and then that's going to create a cycle that's never ending. So I would definitely say start building the discipline of, where do you want to be, where do you want to go, and how do you want to get there, and then understand the tools that are available to you so you can start to accumulate and build that wealth.
I kind of want to get up and yell preach, because that's what I teach on a daily basis. It's just the budgeting 101, the financial 101, and the basics. So Great answer. I love that. Jessica, to you, what is some advice you would give to people on how to start accumulating and start sustaining wealth?
Well, Ralph just shared some great advice, and what there's really no best way to answer this question, and part of that problem is because it's just harder for people to accumulate wealth if they're a person of color or low income, and it's not because of having anything to do with their own actions. Therefore, some of the best solutions are also not related to them or their actions. And obviously, just as Ralph said, there are ways to start accumulating wealth, like building savings, reducing costs, all of those things. But within our current system, it may be impossible for some families to actually do this, as they have no money to save and no costs to cut. And so the common answer is budgeting, but people can't budget their way out of poverty. And there are behavioral economic approaches that our community and individuals can take to build wealth. But this is also both a social and a personal challenge, right? So there are societal constructs and structures that also prevent this, that also need to be addressed.
Absolutely. Food deserts, and just accessibility to healthy foods, cheap foods, or healthcare. So it's more than just one answer. It's a big problem, and there's multiple different solutions that need to come together to help this problem. Kareem, our last question to you, sir. What structural reforms will it take to bridge this racial wealth divide that we have?
Oof. That is another doozy, right? And it touches on what happened when, way back after slavery was abolished, President Andrew Johnson looked at this thing and he said he didn't want to discriminate against white Americans by giving the formerly enslaved people land. This is a difficult thing for a lot of people to hear, right? Because they say, my family didn't own slaves, or I was poor and I pulled myself up from my bootstraps. But even if that's true, it misses a very fundamental point. We built this American dream, particularly on the backs of Black Americans who were deemed property. They themselves were deemed wealth. And for 246 years or so, they built up the American dream for free. And then thereafter, they were purposefully and openly discriminated against for another century or so. And it continues, sometimes less open and notorious, but it's still there. So the science tells us that as a result of this early stain on our country's soul, we have an otherwise inexplicable wealth gap that is widening. It's getting worse. It's not getting any better. So Black, Hispanic, and Latin people are missing the core components of wealth building. There's that initial wealth that they don't have, right? You have little, if any, savings to start with because you didn't get any estate planning gifts from your ancestors they passed. Income, we know for a fact that they're earning less money than their white counterparts. So we talked about savings, right? They have little, if any, and even if they do, it's typically invested in a traditional savings account that's bearing relatively low interest. The type of assets that we have, their cars versus home ownership, business, stocks, bonds. And then finally, there's debt, right? As opposed to coming out with a clean slate from college. Even if you make it to college, but you're more likely to have student loans that burden you as you start out in your career. So you're not saving as much, you're not putting all your money in a 401k because you're still trying to make ends meet, and you're reaching back to help your family members. So what will it take? People, this is probably very controversial, but I say it's getting worse and it's going to require bold steps. And I would say reparations really are a way to do that. And I don't mean, right, you just necessarily give someone 40 acres and a mule, but I do believe that if we truly are serious about taking care of the gap, then perhaps you figure out some sort of way to provide housing that can ultimately be passed down. You figure out a way to provide retirement nest eggs that can again be part of an estate plan and passed down to generate that wealth, free access to lower and higher education such that you can come out of school without having a significant amount of debt to burden you. And these are truly the type of aggressive and equitable ways that we will have to go about solving an ever-growing problem if we are very serious about solving it. Otherwise, what we see is that the wealth gap will continue to widen and continue to grow. To a lesser extent, right, I think that there already is federal and state legislation and monitoring regarding fair wages, but I think we would need more. And I think that private business needs to be very serious about that topic as well. So, long story short, right, if you think about it as a race, right, you have a starting line. You've got one group of people that are hundreds of years ahead on the starting line. You've got another group of people that started out in the race after, we've had some reforms in this country. But if we are in fact going to close the gap and make a material difference, we're going to have to do something material to close the gap on that race. And without that, I think that the science has shown that the problem will continue to be there and perhaps get worse.
Awesome. I think it's one problem, but it's going to take multiple solutions to solve this one problem. But I think this was a great discussion. And I thank you, Jessica, Kareem, and Ralph for all doing your part in working towards a solution and solving this problem. So thank you for having this discussion today. I all love what you guys are doing in the community, and congrats on your success.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Wow, what a powerful panel. I'm so grateful for all of our panelists, their time and energy that they put into this discussion. And also thank you to Dave Sobush and that fantastic data overview. The power of the Huddle for Change initiative is that we get to have community conversations. So we heard a lot about where we stand as a community. We've heard some solutions begin to be put onto the table. But we believe at Community Tampa Bay that the community has the answers themselves for the change that they want to see in their community. So at this time, the most exciting part of the presentation is when we get to turn it over to all of you in small groups. In just a few seconds here, we're going to open up small group breakout rooms. And in each one of those rooms, there will be a Community Tampa Bay trained facilitator. There will be about 5 different rooms, and be sure to say hello to your facilitator as soon as you join. Please go ahead and turn on your camera and unmute yourself. This is an engaging activity and opportunity for you to be able to connect with one another. We'd love for you to use that follow along sheet that we submitted in the chat earlier. If you had any thoughts while you were listening to the panel, to be able to share them amongst your group. And once we've had about 30 minutes in our group, we will shut the rooms down, come right back to this space, and your facilitators will share out what your group talked about. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to your small group facilitators, and we'll see you back in about 30 minutes. Hi, everyone. We're just going to make sure that we have everyone here again. So I'm just going to take a second to let everyone rejoin. It looks like we might have everyone. Oh my goodness. I was able to listen in to one of the small groups, and I am excited to hear all of these share outs. I first and foremost want to thank you for your participation. Really, truly, the value of this is that we get to have community-based conversations to create community-based solutions. And it's just extraordinarily uplifting and empowering to know that we're creating this space. So thank you for that. Today, we took a look at the Tampa Bay partnership data and began to compare our unique experiences, and we got to talk in these small groups. Now what we're going to do is just spend a little bit of time with each of our small group facilitators to share out. We're going to start with Gabrielle.
Hi, yes, we had a great conversation in group 1 that I feel like spanned so many things, but 2 things wanting to highlight of recognizing that we're only able to have conversations like this because of education. One of our group members was talking about, since we are able to have the facts and being able to start there, we're able to have these honest and important conversations that policies such as the Stop Woke Act are trying to prevent, and making sure that we're able to understand the full history, especially the full racist history that the wealth gap is rooted in. And then one other thing to highlight of the difference of like European versus American culture, and this idea of in the US of the availability 24/7 of wanting to be able to access a product and receive it anytime, day or night, and how a lot of times that burden falls on people, of course, to maintain restaurants or fast food places or convenience stores. And what does that look like? And how do we make sure that everyone has equitable opportunity to also have a time for rest and importance and have work be able to end? And a huge part of that is being able to hopefully move towards ending this wealth gap, so we are able to work a little bit better and have higher quality of life.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. I was so inspired. This is the group I got to listen into, and I was so inspired to hear about that conversation, particularly the piece with thinking through our own cultural influences and the things that exist in our day-to-day around us right now, that we can make those small changes, recognizing that there is a racial wealth gap and that oftentimes the hardest work is falling onto Black and Brown people. So what can we do in a day-to-day practice? So thank you so much for you and for your group's share out. Next, we're going to bring up Manolo and his group. Hi, Manolo.
Hello. Hi, I'm Manolo. I use he, him pronouns. So our group really talked a lot about, what are the solutions to some of these problems that we individually can each make and also contribute as a community. Some of the things that were mentioned were connecting people to resources. So making sure that we have that knowledge of resources and being able to give that to the community or whoever really needs those sources to be able to get them out of those tricky situations, as well as a lot of our group members were either nonprofits or in different organizations that were already kind of in the fighting this specific battle. So making sure that, we're using these organizations and we're really putting into this and helping change also mindsets as well can be helpful, specifically for families that are in need. And also sharing power is very important, is that we don't see each other as like, oh, I'm losing something and they're gaining something, so much as we're sharing power and this is equally, or this is beneficial for both of us as a community because we are a community. And then some other things as well, specifically towards the wealth gap, is looking towards our younger generation and making sure that we're including them in the conversation so that they have a say in what's going on, but also giving them the proper education and tools so that way they can build this better future, as well as create this generational change. And monetarily, this wealth tax, making sure that we participate in having the government create a wealth tax that can help redistribute some of this money that's creating this lack in wealth specifically.
Thank you so much, Manolo. I really appreciate all those perspectives and especially highlighting the youth voice and what a powerful element youth can play in creating community-based solutions. So thank you for raising that up, and thank you for your group's input. Next, we're going to hear from Chris Jeter and Group 3.
Yep. So we had a very interesting discussion as well. We kind of focused on the education and kind of the youth. So Group 1 and 2, a little combined to Group 3. We had it starts with school, and it starts with the student age around high school, middle school, teaching them the life skills also needed, but also focusing on their core education, not just the testing that goes on in Florida, so that they can, have just the head start that's needed at that age, so they're not behind, so they're not in debt. And also, we kind of came to the conclusion that allocating monies to low and moderate income families, getting them tutored, getting them life coaching, getting them mentorships in order to prepare them for their next, steps in life, so that they can be successful, so they're not stuck, so they're not at, the standard that they're projected to be at. Also, we kind of came to the conclusion that things just such as, education, furthering your education, healthcare, those things should be provided to you. It should be, that's what's holding us back, is our debts, the bills, the things we pay for, because sometimes separating our wants from our needs are difficult because you can't get your needs that you. And there was one big question that kind of can be resonated with anybody in this group, is who set the standard and why is the gap maybe considered the biggest issue sometimes? That's just a big question that someone posed in my group, and I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate that. And we lost you for a quick second there, but you recovered very quickly. Okay. But really appreciate you raising up the education piece and also the youth piece as well. So thank you for those and also for that question at the end. Next, we're going to go to Jaleesa.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Jaleesa Blackshear. I'm a local activist here in the city of St. Petersburg. So group 4, we just went down the line with the questions. As far as the data and the overview of the panel, the data was disheartening to see 1 out of 5 children in Tampa Bay live in poverty. And Pinellas County here has the largest youth poverty equity gap, where Black children are 4 times more likely to live in poverty. As far as the challenges that families face in Alice in Tampa Bay, our group, I believe Ms. Nancy said financial literacy, right? And the ability to secure loans. Ms. Antoinette Davis also noted that intervention programs, although they are well intended, the approach and the strategy might not necessarily produce the outcome that is intended. Basically, you have to meet people on where they are, and how we can help these families in the Tampa Bay area with, again, more resources. And, we can't donate our time, we can donate our dollar. Number 3, what local, statewide, or federal policies could be put in place to reduce the racial wealth gap? Of course, reparations came. And really viable policy. I believe it was Ms. Simmons who mentioned that there was a city, Evanston, Illinois, had declared a reparation through the legislation of March 23rd, 2019, which allows families, if they can prove their residency, they are able to be allocated some sort of property. And also the programs we need to have in place are programs that rectify ownership. So when people poverty, I say we because I live in poverty, when we are given programs or the opportunity to inherit or acquire wealth, how can we upkeep them? Like if we can't pay the taxes on our property, what's the point of even having it given to us in the first place or being owed? And one policy I mentioned was UBI, which is universal base income. That could be a way to help reduce poverty. Thank you.
Jaleesa, thank you so much. And especially, I appreciate you raising up the comments of your group around the community aspect, and that if we want to solve these issues, we have to ask the community that is impacted by them and ensure that that voice is always centered and is the driving voice of the solution. So thank you for that. And thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your own circumstances that allows for even more reinforcement of that piece of the conversation. So thank you. And then finally, we also have Debriana, who was facilitating our final group. Debriana?
Hi, everyone. My name is Debriana Washington. I use she, her pronouns. And my group, we discussed that caring about others is the primary foundation for how we solve this problem. And one way to close the gap is having conversations like this one and sharing knowledge and implementing plans to put things in motion. We talked a lot about being community-based and having childcare alternatives to such high-cost daycare, and resolving issues around housing. We also talked about student loan forgiveness and also changing the stigma of non-traditional education as a way to close that wealth gap a little bit more. And also one of the last things we talked about was putting a limit on monopolizing investments, which we have been seeing has been happening a lot in Tampa.
So many rich suggestions there, and I'm really excited about taking all of the feedback that we've had from all 5 of these groups and being able to put together these solutions and presenting them forward for our community. Thank you, Debriana, for your group and for those additional points of solution. So thank you. I know we're running right short on time here, but I just want to take a quick moment to just wrap us up and say, first and foremost, thank you to all of the participants. We do truly believe that community-based solutions are the solutions that can eradicate all forms of racial disparity, and specifically here, the racial wealth gap disparity. We also want to raise up and send thank yous to our panelists, as well as to Dave Sobush with our data overview. As panelists talked about, as a small group, participants talked about, it is power to know what the data looks like and to digest the data and interpret the data with our own individual experiences being at the forefront as well. And so we're so grateful that we've been able to create a space for this communication this afternoon. I want to also say that our wonderful partner, the University of South Florida, has created a survey. We'd love for your feedback. It's going to be dropped in the chat right now. In fact, it already was. So thank you for Camila for the support on that. And I just want to say thank you to all of our partners, the Super Bowl Host Committee, NFL Foundation, NFL Inspire Change Initiative, Tampa Bay Partnership, all of our wonderful panelists, companies that they work for. Thank you to all of you for your time and your energy this afternoon. And please keep a lookout. We have a one-pager wealth gap resource guide that you can engage with and continue this conversation. I loved what one panelist I overheard got to say was sometimes, we realize we are in a safe space to be able to have these conversations here, but we also know that we can go out into other spaces and have these conversations, and that is really where we can continue to make change and impact. So with that, I hope that you continue the learning with our one-page document and continue the conversations with each other and others as we continue to envision a community free from all forms of discrimination. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. We've had a great time. See you next time.